The Mike Chambers radio program on the 6th of November, 2009. Our guest today is Lord Christopher Monckton, and we're talking about this Copenhagen Climate Treaty coming up, the conference on the 7th of December of this year in Copenhagen, Denmark. And one of the troubling things, and I guess the most troubling thing in this, is the amount of emissions they want to reduce compared to even to the Kyoto Treaty, and how countries like China and India would be allowed to continue to pollute, and we would actually pay them money for the privilege to do that.
This is one of the most extraordinary facets of the treaty. What they're aiming for now, believe it or not, is to close down 95% of the world economy by 2080. 95%. To drive us straight back to the Stone Age, but without even the right to light a fire in our caves. But they've realized that the poorer countries like China, India, Russia, Indonesia, Brazil, and of course most of the African and South American countries will have to be allowed to continue to increase their output of carbon dioxide in order to bring poverty in their countries to an end, because it's only if you bring poverty to an end that you can stabilize population. It stabilizes by itself if the majority of the population are reasonably well off. You don't have to do anything else. But this won't happen if they stop the poorer countries burning CO2. So they're going to let the poorer countries burn CO2, and the effect of that is that China now burns more CO2 into the atmosphere than the United States does. You know, we're not talking about small figures here. So even if we shut down the whole Western economy and you allow the rest of the world to go on emitting CO2, it certainly won't make any difference to the climate. In fact, even if you close down the whole world's economy, it wouldn't make any difference to the climate because the CO2 isn't harmful. It doesn't cause that much warming. But what this is really all about is it's a profoundly anti-Western desire to shut the West down, to close down our economies, to transfer power forever from us to countries like China, which are not democratic. And I think we've got to wake up and resist this very, very firmly before it's too late. And alas, we now only have weeks to do so, because what is extraordinary about this treaty is that it's been through several drafts already. There's been several negotiating rounds in different exotic locations around the world with thousands of bureaucrats and negotiators from individual states, including the United States, going to attend these negotiating sessions. And yet, even after all these negotiating rounds, nobody has taken out the stuff put in by the bureaucrats about world government, about savage taxation imposed by this world government on wealthy countries, about the power to enforce the will of this new government over and above the elected governments of countries like the United States. All these provisions are still there in the treaty after all these negotiating rounds. Your negotiators, your administration doesn't care about your democracy and is about to sign it away. You need to know that, and you need to stop it. And here's how you can stop it. The first thing you do is you go to www.webcommentary.com and you sign the instrument of repudiation of the Copenhagen Treaty. That's step one. Step two, you telephone, and this works better than email, you telephone your senator, and even if you can't speak to him, because they're very grand and they won't speak to all that many of their constituents, in my experience, nevertheless, try, and if you can't speak to him, make sure you speak to a staffer and tell him the Copenhagen Treaty shall not pass. We will be free. We will maintain our democracy. We will not let our government sign it away, and we will not let our Senate ratify it. Because if Obama signs it, then, at least in theory, he is supposed to make sure that the Senate ratifies it by a two-thirds majority. 67 senators have to vote in favor for this treaty to become law. Now, I don't think he'll get 67 senators, but what worries me is that he knows that perfectly well, and he will therefore find some other way of pushing this treaty onto you. He could, for instance, enact it into domestic law by a simple majority of each house, and then his signature on the bill. Or he can do it by executive authority. There's a procedure called the executive agreement by which he can make and sign and bind the US to a treaty just with his own signature. Now, In the past, it would have been unthinkable for him to break the rules of your Constitution by doing that. But now that we've seen what Barbara Boxer is prepared to do in the Senate, flagrantly to flout the rules of the House in order to drive through a bill that the House doesn't want, then I wouldn't be at all surprised to find that Obama might try the shifty way of getting this treaty through by signing it under his executive authority. And it's not entirely clear that anyone can stop him if he does, or that the Supreme Court would stop him if he does.
Right, because they've already, through executive fiat, there's so many regulations they already put in now that should never be in, that go way outside of their authority, but nothing is said. There's one, that's certainly an option. And, of course, you can always stick these different planks of the treaty inside amendments, inside bills that run through Congress that never see the light of day when they're 1,000 pages long, and you get essentially what you need done without the ratification process.
That's the danger, and there are numerous ways under your Constitution, unfortunately, whereby that sort of very cheesy, very dishonest way of getting treaties in by the back door can be inflicted on you. And if this were a minor treaty, you might say, oh, well, it's an inconvenience that they're doing this and breaking the law and disregarding the Constitution. But this is a big treaty. This is a treaty which will effectively bring your Constitution altogether to an end. It will, in the words of one of your constitutional experts, whom I consulted a couple of weeks ago before I went public on this, he said, this will trump our Constitution. It will render it null and void. There will no longer be democracy. Oh, yes, you can elect whoever you like as your leaders, but they will have no power to stop this great panjandrum, this global dictatorial government from taking over.
Indeed, it's insipid and insidious, because if the CO2 is really the problem they claim it is, let's just say for a moment that it is the global killer. It's going to ruin us. The solution is plant more trees.
Well, there are many different solutions, none of which will make the slightest difference, and here is why. Supposing we were to work out a few simple figures, and you need a pencil and paper for this, because it's really very easy. Now, what we do is this. We say that every 6 months, the world emits 15 billion tons of CO2 into the atmosphere. It sounds a lot, but the atmosphere is huge, and the only difference that makes is to increase the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere by 1 part per million every 6 months. That's how little our effect is on the planet.
Wow.
Now, here we go. What we now do is we work out that the UN is forecasting that there will be an extra 468 parts per million of CO2 emitted to the atmosphere over the next 100 years. Multiply that by 15 billion tons per part per million, which we've just established, and that means the UN is implicitly forecasting that the world, unless we stop it, will emit 7 trillion tons of CO2 over the next century. So write down 7 trillion tons. That's 468 times 15 billion. Right. Now we divide that 7 trillion tons by 7 Fahrenheit degrees, which is the amount of warming the UN says will happen. We now know it's actually only going to be about 1 Fahrenheit degree, maybe 2 at the most, but they say 7. And you therefore get 1 trillion tons of CO2 emission equals, roughly speaking, 1 Fahrenheit degree of warming. Right. And so what that means is that because we're only emitting 30 billion tons of CO2 a year, it's going to take you 1 trillion divided by 30 billion, which is 33 years of having no CO2 emitted anywhere in the world. You will not have an auto. There will be no trains, no planes. Most of the power stations will close. 85% of your electricity supplies in the United States will disappear for 33 years, just to prevent 1 Fahrenheit degree of warming. And that's why, even if CO2 is as big a problem as the UN says it is, the attempt to solve this problem by reducing or cancelling, even totally cancelling our output, would make practically no difference at all.
All right, we'll come back more with Lord Monckton right around the corner. Those figures are staggering. We'll talk more about that when we come back. Stay with us. It's the Mike Chambers radio program.